In our second webinar, we discuss with our panel why data and technology are important for peace and security. This is what our speakers had to say.
Despite years of knowledge, the humanitarian world has for too long still been responding after the fact.
Getting access to data and the use of more innovative statistical techniques could speed up our learning process.
And science without data is just a story, right? Data is absolutely critical for scientific endeavor. Right now, there are big moves towards having much more real-time vision of what's happening in terms of food security. I think that's a game changer for prevention. In agriculture, we're on the cusp now of a real revolution in how satellites can be informing what's going on in the field.
So looking at how we can move from being reactive to situations, to anticipating situations and preventing at times the disaster consequences by having early warnings.
How can we, as a community, do better to integrate advances on data and technologies for peace and security?
The problem we have right now across the board in so many institutions, data is everywhere, but it's hard to access. And so we need to get it, reduce the barriers, get closer to it, organize it much better.
To ask people who are experiencing things that we specifically know are from climate change early and getting in there and being able to test our models on that would be very innovative and a real step forward.
Because in our experience, it's very often that last mile from the knowledge to the local action that is missing.
We have a huge responsibility of this, creating this platform for deep integrations, where not only humanitarians but development communities as well can work together. World Food Program, despite having a very pervasive and capillary presence in many of these countries, cannot and does not work in isolation.
In all the technology innovations that we have at our disposal in this day and age, that we make the connection to the people that need to actually take these actions on the ground.
Welcome all to our third CGIAR Climate Security webinar series. My name is Peter Lederach, lead CGIAR Climate Security. We are extremely encouraged to see the enormous interest in climate security and the role science and the CGIAR can play. More than 4,000 practitioners, scientists and policymakers joined each of our first two webinars. In the first webinar, panelists agreed on the importance of including science, particular food systems and climate science to inform peace agreements, operations and programming. The second webinar proceeded to discuss the role of data and disruptive technology for peace and climate security. Today, we are looking forward to discussing with our distinguished panelists the role of sustainable finance for peace. Most countries suffering from conflict are at the same time highly vulnerable to climate and struggle with natural resource degradation. How can sustainable finance help to align different objectives and its incentives to foster climate-smart peace? This will be a key question of our today's discussion. Before starting our panel discussion, let us watch a short video clip introducing the CGIAR Climate Security webinar series.
Debates continue to take place on whether and to what extent climate plays a role in exacerbating conflicts. Outside of these debates, the complex interactions and feedback loops between climate and conflict are a major threat to livelihoods, affecting millions as we speak. This is likely to worsen in the future. Climate change is a reality, and its effects will be profound at a global scale. Understanding and addressing these complex interactions between climate and conflict is likely one of the keys to achieving long-lasting peace. Until now, we have not addressed conflicts with a climate-smart approach and the urgency the matter deserves. Climate and conflict experts have much to improve in how they collaborate and exchange with each other. Finding common ground among the different perspectives is crucial. The way to address the complex connections between climate, conflict and peace is to adopt a systemic perspective towards food systems and natural resources, focusing on the key interactions for science and policy making that are central to long-lasting peace. We invite you to join our CGIAR Climate Security webinar series with live and interactive sessions connecting science and policy in the context of climate security and conflict. Our goal is to highlight the importance of developing sustainable food systems and natural resource management as a foundation for long-lasting peace.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm the editor of the UN and Global Affairs website, UN Dispatch, and host of the Global Dispatches podcast. Today's conversation about sustainable finance for peace and climate security is being recorded as a live taping of the Global Dispatches podcast. Now, many of you who registered for the webinar ahead of time were asked a polling question. How can sustainable finance deliver peace? And I'd like to read a summary of your answers right now. Sustainable finance can be mobilized to provide alternative income sources for communities, restore and conserve natural resources, establish social protection measures, and strengthen resilience in people and institutions to cope with various shocks. Through targeting of specific populations, i.e. the poorest within communities, sustainable finance can promote equity, reduce income inequalities, and address the root causes of poverty. These livelihood improvements are key for promoting peace. And I think the answers to that polling question tee up our conversation today very nicely. Sustainable and innovative finance in the global development sector is very much an emerging field. Historically, development finance has mostly been the remit of the public sector through official development assistance, or ODA, provided by wealthy donor countries. To be sure, donor governments and development assistance from official sources are still dominant in this space, but it's becoming increasingly apparent that traditional development aid through governments and philanthropy is just not sufficient to meet the needs. In fact, the United Nations estimates that there is a $2.5 trillion annual financing gap to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which are due in just 10 years' time. And this gap, I think, presents a profound opportunity for private capital. Attracting private capital sector funds to fill the humanitarian, climate, and development funding gap may be the only way to achieve many of the Sustainable Development Goals. And how to access and use private capital to support climate security is the topic of our conversation today. Our expert panel, which I will introduce in just a moment, will discuss how sustainable finance can be leveraged in support of what is known as the humanitarian development peace nexus. This is the idea that emergency humanitarian relief, longer-term economic development, which can include climate adaptation, and conflict prevention all exist along a continuum and very much in relationship to each other. So the key question we will be tackling today is how innovative financing solutions that include private capital can better align humanitarian, development, and peace objectives. So to that end, I am very pleased to introduce our panel. Aditi Gupta is Manager, Market Acceleration and Design Funding at Convergence Blended Finance. Welcome, Aditi. Serena Guarna-Skelly is Partner and Innovative Finance Advisor at COIS. Welcome, Serena. Giovanni Grandi is Senior Officer, Private Partnerships and Finance for Development at the Italian Agency for Development Cooperation. Welcome.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, welcome, Giovanni. And Ania Maria Wanda Grobuk is Deputy Director of Adaptation at the Green Climate Fund, or GCF. Welcome, Ania.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Mark.
And Alberto Milan is Sustainable Finance Advisor, CGIAR Research Program on Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security. Welcome, Alberto. Once again, welcome to everyone. And I am very excited to kick off our discussion. Aditi, I would like to start with you. Using the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, can you explain the current role that blended finance is playing in the SDGs? And where is blended finance having the most impact? Where are we seeing the least such investments? Can you give us the lay of the land a little bit?
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here, and thank you for having me. I look forward to chatting with you and all the panelists today. Starting off with your question, I think it's useful just to take a step back and understand what is a blended finance. Convergence being the global network of blended finance, we define blended finance as the strategic use of catalytic capital, and I'll come back to that in just a second, from public or philanthropic sources to mobilize and increase private sector investment in sustainable development goals, all aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So what is catalytic capital? Catalytic capital is capital that is concessional in nature. It is below market rate return capital, so you could call it soft money. It's not looking for market rate return. So it could be from public sources like donor governments. It could be from philanthropic sources like large foundations or charities. And that is money that is looking for impact first. And then maybe some form of return. It could be in the form of a grant where there's no return at all, or it could be concessional debt or equity where there is some return expected. And in a blended finance transaction, a catalytic capital sits alongside with commercial capital from the private sector. And this commercial capital has a different orientation. It is looking for market rate returns. It is pension fund money. It is private equity fund money. And so blended finance gets both of these capital sources together to create more investment opportunity for the Sustainable Development Goals. And you might ask, why is this needed? And as you pointed out, there is currently a $2.5 trillion gap and for financing the Sustainable Development Goals. And I want to pause there and say it's in the $1 trillion. When you look at official development assistance flows, you look at private development assistance flows, they add up to a couple of $100 billion. And so the question is, how do you make up that gap? And it's the private sector that operates at the trillions of dollars scale. That is where in the capital markets, the trillions of dollars exist. And so how do you get the private sector to invest in sustainable development? And blended finance as a structuring approach looks to do exactly that, to create the risk return profile of an investment opportunity such that it makes the private sector attracted to invest there, but at the same time, the catalytic capital providers are making sure that the impact is there, the development is being achieved. And so to just take it as a small example, if you think of maybe a loan facility to finance small and medium enterprises in emerging markets, and you're looking to attract a commercial investor into that loan facility, a commercial investor might see that opportunity and say the returns are priced right, but maybe it's just too risky for that investor to invest. If some things were to change, maybe the investor would invest there. So what could be done is you could have a catalytic capital provider maybe providing a cheaply priced guarantee for that facility. And what that guarantee is doing is mitigating the risk for the investor, the private sector investor, and saying, okay, why don't you go ahead and invest? And if there is a default, I will make that up to you. So that is how a risk mitigation mechanism for blended finance can work to increase investment.
Thank you.
Of course, this is one type, and we can talk about more later.
Oh, well, we'll certainly dive into the nitty-gritty details later in this conversation. I look forward to that. But let me now turn to Serena to give us sort of an example of blended finance and innovative finance for development that you helped create. You were instrumental in creating what's known as the Humanitarian Impact Bond. Can you just describe how does it work and how did you come up with this idea?
Thanks, Mark, and with pleasure. And thank you for having me and for facilitating such a fascinating discussion. So perhaps I would like to provide a little bit of context to put impact bonds in the world of blended finance and innovative finance that Aditi just described, and then I'll come to the specific example of the humanitarian impact bond. So my first comment is, as we think the background of this discussion around the complexity of the issues and the interconnectedness of the issues we're trying to solve, climate change, energy and food security and peace building. And when you're thinking, like us, we are an intermediary that focuses on structuring financial transactions that bring together public and private capital. So when you think about structuring finance for this very complex set of challenges, one challenge you have is that a lot of financial instruments do boil down to very simple terms, and they do force you to think about what is the issue that I'm trying to solve, and often are not able to capture all the complexity. So just to say, it is a way to focus us on a specific aspect of the problem and focusing on what capital can do in a very otherwise complex ecosystem. And in that backdrop, I would like to say that, as you very well described at the beginning, official development assistance is looking increasingly to private capital to come in and partner, yet it still plays such a precious role, particularly when it comes to climate security and peace building, because it's a role, particularly in the areas of humanitarian assistance, relief, where grants are still the most precious and has to be used, to Aditi's point, in the most catalytic way as a resource against such great needs. So coming to innovating finance, blended finance, and impact bonds, I'd like to first preface that the way I like to think about them is more as a toolkit, meaning that you need to first start asking the question about what is the issue that I'm trying to solve. And when it comes, for example, specifically to impact bonds, issues often revolve around existing programs and ways to drive cost efficiencies that provide value to public funders and official development assistance that is still scarce and valuable, to focus on the more cost-effective interventions. And so in a way, they focus very much on what in innovating finance is called performance-based funding. Well, the donors only pays truly for what they care for, which are results and outcomes. And the second feature in an impact bond is private sector, in this case investors, and the role that they can play in an instrument. So when a donor only pays when outcomes are achieved, there is a question about who's going to fund the program upfront. So in a performance-based grant, the service providers has to put resources and capital to use, their own balance sheet, to start working on the program. And then upon delivery of the results, they receive the funding. Now, in an impact bond, that role is played by an investor. And this is where the private sector is brought in as a different and new party, often in the space of, like in this case, humanitarian assistance. And the private sector is willing to put capital at risk by front loading. And then they only get paid if and only if results are achieved. Which brings me to the example of the ICRC. I think the way we came up with this idea was there was a general need to bring more funding and more diverse funding to the space of, in this case, physical rehabilitation. The ICRC has a huge portfolio, multi-country, multi-year, of running physical rehabilitation in many conflict-afflicted or post-conflict countries. And so often relies on, and Giovanni might be able to compare and explain the reasons through the donor's lens against the traditional backdrop, which is typically either contingency funding or annual grants to run operations. Now, when you think about physical rehabilitation, one thing that really helps, particularly in a conflict-afflicted country, is how long the program takes. So there's a very long construction period, typically 3 years, during which staff is trained, and then there's an operation period. And so one of the questions that the IRC was facing was, how can we actually rely on more sustained funding over the period? And by structuring the impact bond, not only they receive that capital upfront for 5 years, but we're also able to make investments that, Giovanni, I'd love to know what you think, are sometimes hard to make in the space of physical rehabilitation or humanitarian assistance. In this case, it was investing in an IT system that would allow the ICRC to be, as you may know, it's a very cost-effective, is seen as a very good value for money for donors as an organization. By investing in this IT system up front, the ICRC is now able to improve their performance management beyond what donors have traditionally been able to benefit. And by doing that, actually they're able to improve results. So from a lens of a public donor compared to a traditional grant, they're getting more beneficiaries for the same money.
Well, let's bring in that public and government perspective. Giovanni, it's great to have you on the conversation, to have a perspective of a government in this. And your government, the Italian government, played an instrumental role in the humanitarian impact bond. So could you describe that role and why the Italian government and your agency decided to invest in something like that?
Thank you, Mark, and happy to be on the panel. Well, Serena has perfectly well explained the mechanism of the bond. Maybe the view side from a donor standpoint might be interesting, in the sense that, as it was said before, usually for humanitarian interventions, what a bilateral donor like we are has as in terms of tool, mainly has the grants, which is the most precious resource in order to catalyze the private investments. Now, the impact bond was very innovative in 2017 when it was launched, because usually the requirements from an implementing agency like ICRC was to ask for donors to provide the funding, as Serena was saying, to implement the project, which might have a 5-year tenor, but they needed the funding starting day one in order to have all the rehabilitation work done. Now, putting into the picture the private investors, this has allowed us as a donor to have a mechanism where effectively we are paying for what we get. It's a pay for result instrument. And the interesting thing is that apart from the cost of the initiative, the increase in performance which ICRC is committed to deliver on this initiative has been really the driver for which, as a donor, we decided to maybe pay an amount which is a little bit higher to the effective, compared to the effective costs of the initiative, because we were sure that increasing efficiency, the number of beneficiaries would have increased. So the impact of the initiative itself would have been leveraged by the improvement of the implementing agents. The target, just to give you an idea of increase in efficiency, is 80% compared to a baseline which ICRC has created in terms of having experience in the rehabilitation starting 1979. So it's long-term experience that ICRC has. And so the maximum exposure of a donor will get at the point where the efficiency is improved by 80% compared to the baseline. So this is one of the major reasons. The second point is that normally the impact bonds are used not really on humanitarian, in the humanitarian field, because the involvement of the private sector, as Aditi was explaining before in the blending activity, whilst the private sector is seeking for returns, well, humanitarian typically does not give returns for an investor. So the fact of using an impact bond on a sector which typically does not create financial returns was the second challenge that we were very interested in getting.
Well, thank you, Giovanni. I wanted to bring Anya into the conversation from your perspective as someone who works at a multilateral finance institution. First, can you just, for people who are unfamiliar, explain what is the Green Climate Fund, and then explain how you work with private capital to make investments in climate security initiatives? Anya, you please unmute.
Yes, thanks
Great.
very much, Mark. So the Green Climate Fund was formed under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, specifically as a financial mechanism. And it's a very innovative sort of fund. The board is made up of 50% developed countries and 50% developing countries. And I think we very much fall into the category of what Aditi called catalytic capital. So we really look to de-risk projects so that private investors can come in. I can give you some figures as to what the Green Climate Fund has done so far. So starting in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, as our objective is to invest in low emissions and climate resilient development in support of the Paris Agreement. We have invested 5.3 billion of our own capital to date, and with co-financing of 13.6 billion. So with a total portfolio of about $19 billion now, after 5 years of operation. We have a lot of the world's governments on board, 194 governments working together. And in fact, 2/3 of the work that we do is through the public sector, and 1/3 is through the private sector. So that's the balance at the moment as it stands. We would love to be crowding in more private sector involvement, and particularly on the adaptation side. To date, the private sector has shown more interest in the mitigation projects, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and so on. But the interest of this panel is to talk about the intersection of development, humanitarian support, and peace building. And this is really where adaptation comes in, because the climate shocks are going to be potentially, fueling the sort of stresses and increasing risks to poor and vulnerable people worldwide. And so investing in adaptation is, I think, a very effective way of peace building and reducing risks before the extreme events happen.
Good. Well, we can maybe drill down later in this conversation and think of ways and opportunities for adaptation to be a vehicle for a target for private sector investment. Thank you. Alberto, what can CGIAR do to add value to discussions about innovative finance for climate security? And what role can an institution like CGIAR play in this space?
Hi, Mark, and hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. That is a really interesting question. For those of you that are not familiar with the CGIAR, we are the world's largest agricultural innovation network. We operate in more than 70 countries around the world, and we basically provide cutting-edge research and science to provide solutions to transform food systems. So the main goal that we have is basically to build low carbon and climate resilient food systems. And then we work on the intersection between and the nexus of food systems, natural resources, environment, and health. So when we look at climate and conflict affected areas, we see that the underlying issues are always around natural resource management, climate, food systems. And we have a lot of experience and then partners across the world work in this very environment. So just to give you a concrete example, we have a sustainable finance team that specifically works with both public and private sector. On the public sector, we work with governments and international financial institutions. And then with the private sector, we work with asset owners, asset managers, and then corporates and agribusinesses. The core of our intervention is helping increase and strengthen livelihoods of farmers that are the ones more afflicted by this type of humanitarian context. And what we do in the sustainable finance world is basically three key areas or three key services. Not like we work with private sector mostly to co-design innovative investment solutions. So that can be from the design of an impact bond to supporting the design of an impact investment fund. We have experience setting up several of these innovative solutions, and we have leveraged private capital with leverage ratios of 1 to 7, 1 to 8. So that means leveraging 7 times in private capital of the public capital that has been provided, of that precious capital that Giovanni and Serena were mentioning before. Then the second area of intervention that we do is providing advisory services and providing research to understand better or help understand better where to deploy that capital, and then how to work with the farmers on the ground to make sure that those investments achieve the sustainable development impact, and then to monitor the impact of those investments. And then the third one is around generating cutting-edge research, so that we can provide that type of science and knowledge to the very partners that need this type of interventions.
Thank you. I want to encourage in this next round of questions for panelists to feel free to engage each other. But Aditi, I'd like to go back to you. Is it fair to say that of all the sustainable development goals, Sustainable Development Goal 16, the one related to peace and security issues, is the one in which there is the least amount of blended finance? And if so, why do you think that is?
Thanks, Mark. That's a good observation, and that is indeed correct. At Convergence, we recently mapped the different sustainable development goals to blended finance activity, and we found that SDG 16 was one of the least aligned. And this goes back to one of the points that both Serena and Giovanni mentioned, that in humanitarian assistance, we see a huge role for grants, and grants are the most active. And I think the reason for this is that we must recognize that blended finance and sustainable activities are not a panacea. They are one tool in a toolbox. And for blended finance to work, the underlying activity has to generate a positive financial return. There has to be some revenue generation. And so, as you had mentioned at the beginning, when you look at it as a continuum, emergency humanitarian assistance, I think, is most aligned with traditional donor assistance and charitable work. That is not where there is a quote unquote money to be made. But when you look at medium to long-term assistance, and you look at economic reconstruction and resiliency, I think that's where blended finance has a larger role to play. And there's a place for innovative mechanisms like the humanitarian impact bond that was discussed. But when you look at mapping across SDGs, we see that blended finance has demonstrated significant alignment to climate and environment related SDGs, like climate action, SDG 13, affordable and clean energy, and sustainable cities. But I would say that, as Anya had reflected also, a lot of the financing has been towards mitigation mechanisms in blended finance, and adaptation mechanisms are still growing. And when you think about climate security, as we're discussing in this panel, I think we need to think about cross-cutting approaches that are cutting across SDGs and are not in silos, while at the same time, maintaining that the core of the transaction remains investable.
Thank you. And sort of picking up along Aditi's point about sort of that emergency humanitarian assistance, not necessarily lending itself to blended finance and innovative, sustainable finance. Serena, first, do you agree with that assessment? And when you're looking across that humanitarian development peace nexus, what opportunities along that nexus do you see for further investments from private capital? Is there a particular point along that continuum that right now perhaps isn't being tapped but ought to be?
Yeah, no, great. I completely agree with Aditi's assessment, and also where they have observed the emergence of blended funds and private sector solutions where the gaps still remain, and humanitarian assistance still being a place where the public funding still plays a major role. So maybe I have a two-pronged answer. One is that something like the humanitarian impact bond, although quite big, by the way, in the world of impact bonds, 26 million francs, it is small compared to the funding that comes from these public donors into the space of physical rehabilitation or emergency assistance. And it's small even in the lens of the ICRC balance sheet, but I say small but significant. I think it has been a signal to market that it is possible to craft sustainable public-private partnerships in a difficult space like physical rehabilitation and in otherwise not very investable geographical or sectoral context. And I think there's been the significance of a relationship created between the service provider, its public donors, and the private investors, in this case, Munich Re and the private clients of Lombard Odier. And that relationship has evolved over time in terms of having a conversation even with someone like Munich Re around where else can an insurance company bring skills and products into the space. So I see it as a small, significant, and an opening of opportunities beyond what the size of the humanitarian impact bond is. And then to talk about with a different lens that goes back to, I think, a comment that you picked on, Mark, from the responses before the session today, an area where I see huge opportunities, the space of livelihood. Now, there is, as you said, there's a gap between what happens in the first 6 months after the onset of a crisis and linking that to broader development. But as crises are now, we have accepted that now crises are prolonged. If you take, for example, the Syrian crisis, now the average time that refugees spend, for example, in a refugee camp or in a non-permanent setting, tends to be extended and become semi-permanent. And so I see the space of livelihoods. We're currently working on a product that looks at livelihoods for Syrian refugees and vulnerable local populations as a way to bridge the phases of emergency funding where you're thinking about the most direct response with more longer term and more sustainable solutions. And I think independently of whether it's an impact bond or working capitals or other forms of financing, I think there's huge opportunity looking at livelihoods as a part of that solution.
So can I ask you, and just very briefly, can you describe what that program that you're looking at is? You sort of teased it, so I just in a minute, can you describe what that is?
Yeah, of course. So it's an impact bond. Actually, it has the aspiration to become a longer term, more of an outcome fund. We're looking at different programmatic interventions that target Syrian refugees in countries neighboring of Syria, and looking at how to improve the social and economic reintegration of these refugees in the new local context, which is likely to be a protracted a new normal, as we say nowadays with COVID. And so we did a landscape study where we looked at across different programmatic activities, across microfinance, across vocational training, across support to home-based businesses, and other more specialized trainings like coding. And we structured the first transaction, which is an impact bond that helps a not-for-profit link Syrian refugees and Jordanian vulnerable population to sustainable jobs, and links the payment of the donors not to the training or finding a job, but more to whether the household in the longer term has better income and is, as a result, more resilient.
Okay. Thank you. That's fascinating. Thank you. And Anya, I want to turn to you because earlier in your opening remarks, you observed that adaptation was an area where there was not much private sector investment. How can an organization like GCF and maybe the private sector facility in particular at GCF more proactively look to make investments around adaptation? Are there tools you need? Is there support you need? What needs to fall into place in order for adaptation to be a higher priority? And I think you might need to unmute.
right? I'd like to give you a couple of examples just to illustrate how actually the private sector can get involved in adaptation. So my favorite example is the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, which works with smallholder farmers across 4 African countries. This is a project which is set up for a 12-year period, funding from GCF of $26 million and equity funding from Acumen of $30 million. And the ambition is to reach 10 million beneficiaries over the 12-year period. So what this project is setting out to do is really to support smallholder farmers through setting up a number of initiatives, a number of services, aggregator platforms, digital platforms, providing climate services and financial services, such as microcredit, microinsurance to smallholder farmers, helping to link them into the global value chains for products such as cotton, coffee, and rice, and focusing, in fact, on women-headed households very much. But these are, the objective is to really stimulate entrepreneurial activity and MSMEs, in particular the micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. The ambition is to have between 18 and 20 successful companies operating by the end of the project. And so this is a very clear mechanism, you know, of actually stimulating private sector activity within this area of supporting smallholder farmers. And just very quickly, a similar example can be found in the area of supplying climate information and early warning systems, and what we often call climate services, where the bulk of the investments are often made by governments in the networks that are forecasting the climate events that are coming. But there is really a substantial private sector activity that can be stimulated, particularly in the area of the operation and maintenance of the early warning systems and the forecasting instrumentation, but also in terms of providing insurance products, for example, based on the climate information that's available. So parametric insurance, forecast-based financing, paying out on the forecast of a climate event occurring, rather than paying out for the damage that happens after the event has occurred. So these are the sorts of innovative products that are being developed and that the private sector is getting very involved in.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Alberto, I want to turn to you now. What research do you think is needed to better understand how sustainable finance can bridge that humanitarian development peace nexus, and how can CGIAR help with this?
Thank you, Mark. That is a really good question. So I think we can support by focusing on 2 main areas of work. No? The first one would be around building resilience. So we can use science to anticipate what is going to happen, and instead of waiting for a situation that can be, even when being incredibly complex, addressed by development work. And what we see is that often leads to a humanitarian situation. So we can anticipate what is likely to happen, and then we can work with farmers and the different communities affected to build resilience to climate change, so that over time we can generate those revenue streams that Aditi and Serena were mentioning before. No? So if we want the private sector to come in, we need to be able to build those systems and then create the conditions for farmers to be able to generate those revenue streams. And then the second one is around what science does well, which is providing data. There is something that Aditi was mentioning before as well, no? On the risk-return profile. So what we can do is generate a wealth of data to help understand better what are the risks and what is the risk exposure, and then how to reduce and mitigate those risks. And then we can also look at the return aspect of that ratio, and then we can provide data to understand what is the performance of MSMEs and micro and small medium enterprises, and then understand which ones can generate those revenue streams, and also what additional revenue streams can be generated from ecosystem services, from carbon, and from other revenue streams. So those are the two key pieces that if we were to provide that data, we believe that the private investors would find easier to make investment decisions.
Thank you. And Giovanni, turning to you now again from the kind of government perspective, how can governments use their resources more innovatively to leverage private capital? Is there do mindsets need to change in governments in general, and the Italian government in particular, to help take this the next step forward and further unlock private capital for investments in peace?
Well, I must say that as governments and then as donors in general with public funds, we're all trying to do our best, and the Green Climate Fund is one of the examples, in order to engage the private sector. Now, at the end of the game, it's an issue of combining interests of an equation which is leading financial investors between risk and return, and the aim of a government in terms of measuring impact. So the real point, I believe, is that we ought to get to a point where there is a common ground in terms of definition and measurability of the impact, because not necessarily we're on the same page. If you think that the financial market has been very proactive and is very proactive in stimulating, also because it's stimulated by investors, in looking for investments that are compliant, if you want, with what investors are asking for, i.e. environmental, social, and government's impact. Now, how this is linked to the SDGs, which is really the aim of a public donor, is something that we ought to get to a common conclusion. I'm very confident, also because as donor countries, we are working together with the OECD in finding a common ground between pure financial investors and donors, in finding if you want concrete and measurable tools to measure the impact. So I believe that it's not a question of changing mindsets from a government standpoint, but it's really trying to bring together the interests of the private and the commercial actors together with who is taking care of development. I was interested in what Aditi was saying about the blending, and I'm even though the role of blending has been very much increasing in the last years, one of the interesting things for me is that I'm seeing that from the data that are coming out, the amount of blended finance allocated to the least developed countries is still very low. So I'm just thinking that probably we ought to improve the toolkits that we have as governments in terms of the de-risking on one side, but having clear in mind which are the targets.
And Aditi, do you want to respond to that? You know, I mean, it is interesting that it seems much like development assistance as a whole, blended finance instruments, you know, the great proportion of it do not actually go to the least developed countries, the countries that are perhaps most vulnerable along that humanitarian development piece nexus. Why is that? And what can be done to spur investment in LDCs or least developed countries?
Thanks, Mark. And Giovanni, that's an interesting point that you bring up. And in fact, recently, Convergence and the UNCDF put out a report where we reflected on this observation that most of the blended finance flows are not going to the least developed economies. And I think that ties back to the point that we were talking about earlier, that blended finance is most appropriate in a situation where there are investable solutions and where you can generate financial return. So if you are looking at a least developed economy and there is a lot of risk in the market itself, plus if you are looking to do a risky investment structure, maybe that is not the right approach, or maybe that is not a situation where you're looking at scale, but you're looking at targeted interventions. So I think it's a question of using different toolkits in different places. And one of the things that we found that has been useful is market acceleration activities. So we at Convergence have recognized that there are not enough transactions that are actually getting to market where a public or private sector investor can invest. And so what we have done is supported through design funding grants, where we are funding the design of these transactions. And an example of that is the livelihood impact bond that Serena had mentioned, to get more of these transactions into the market.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in? If not, I can move ahead. Okay, so we have just about 5 or 6 minutes left, and I really want to push all 5 of you to think what else needs to be done to unlock private capital in service and to harness private capital in service of climate security. I mean, we started this conversation by noting a $2.5 trillion annual gap. What steps can be taken to move the conversation forward and bring in more sustainable finance to scale in this space? Is there science and data and research we need? Is it a matter of political will? What else needs to be done? So Anya, I'll kick that question to you. From your perspective, how can we unleash and unlock more private capital into this space?
Okay, Mark, I think that a lot of it is to do with awareness, that perhaps private sector investors are not yet aware that mechanisms exist like GCF that are actually actively seeking private capital, that are prepared to do the de-risking, to involve them in projects, to provide, guarantees, to provide equity, as well as providing loans at concessional rates to make projects attractive, and to get the sort of financial structuring of a project that will actually make it viable. So we're trying to get the message out there. The private sector facility is actively, wooing private sector investors, and we're seeing from year to year, that the level of interest is certainly growing. And I think as the portfolio grows and as there are more and more examples of successful projects where you do get financial reflows coming through, where the de-risking is working effectively, then we're going to start seeing that portfolio growing. And hopefully growing exponentially to match the urgency of the need that we see out there.
Thank you. And hopefully this conversation and subsequent podcast episode will help spread the word, as you say, and get the word out. Serena, I'd like to sort of turn that question to you now. What else needs to happen to scale up investments in this space and scale up the kind of projects that need to be undertaken in this space?
Sure, and since Anya already talked about awareness, which I think, and also matchmaking, which is something that maybe Aditi can talk at some point, maybe I'll offer a slightly different point of view, better products. And so, as I said, I think there are a lot of issues that need to be tackled, and finding the right tool that addresses that issue, and through efforts like GCF and Convergence, bringing the right sources of capital to it. And the second one that I would like to add is also mindset adjustments. And going back to the question you asked earlier from Giovanni, I do think it's not just for public donors, even for private investors, there's still a bit of a mismatch between what they aspire to do. So for example, deforestation-free value chains, or longer term from a public donor perspective, more sustainable programs or longer term funding, and then the mechanics about how capital is allocated and the constraints that hence these actors, not just donors, but also investors have when they actually make funding decisions. And so I do think there's a little bit of a mindset change in terms of, for example, if you talk about the great initiative that Anya mentioned, we work a lot in smallholder finance, the tenors, the time to finance, the time to revenue generation just does not match currently the risk return profiles of many, or where most of the capital now sits, which is institutional investor. They often take 10 to 12 years to manifest. And so I think it is a little bit of adjust your expectation. There is good money to be made if you have the right expectations and you adjust your tools to be able to actually participate in some of these investment opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you. So Aditi, your name checked in Serena's answer, so I must turn to you. What else do you think needs to be done to scale up private capital in this space?
Thanks, Mark, and also Serena. I think, like Serena mentioned, matching is really important, and you want to make sure that you are matching the private sector to the right set of opportunities and to the right tools. And one thing I would like to mention here is that we should not overlook local capital markets when we are thinking of financing, especially riskier investments, right? Local capital markets often have money that understands the local investment climate, is more familiar with the risks of that climate, and can invest in situations where your traditional institutional capital, which is looking for jurisdictions where they've already invested in or where they're comfortable with, or looking at large scale, cannot invest. So using catalytic capital to de-risk local capital market investment, I think is also another important thing that we should be thinking of.
Thank you. And Giovanni, to you, same question, and final thoughts. What else can be done? What should the next steps be in terms of moving this conversation forward and unleashing private capital?
Well, honestly, I think that all the panelists have been touching, at least in my mind, the main changes that need to be made. So from a government standpoint, what I can say is that there also needs to be a change in terms of being more connected to what is happening on the market compared to what is a traditional, if you want, funding mechanism that each donor has. So trying to co-create initiatives with the different players and actors is the only way to get to something that is effective in terms of the beneficiaries, in terms of the donors, in terms of the investors.
Thank you. And Alberto, I will turn it to you to close out our conversation. What should some of our next steps be, and where should our focus be at this point?
Thank you, Mark. I just wanted to build on what Giovanni just mentioned. I think is critical. We need much more collaboration across different actors. There are language barriers, so not always the public sector understands what the private sector needs. And as I was mentioning, the private sector has some expectations that don't match with what the public sector does. And then most of the innovative financial structures, if not all, they always have a wide range of actors involved that come from completely different backgrounds and there are different stakeholders. So I think we need to look at much more collaboration across partners, and then what Giovanni mentioned on the co-creation, I think is critical to understand the comparative advantages of each stakeholder and then what are the strengths and the commonalities, and then start building from there.
Well, thank you, Ann. That's a great note to end it on, the need for collaboration against different sectors. And I think this panel itself is a good example of that, having so many people from so many different perspectives joining this conversation. Thank you all in the audience for following along. Thank you for your questions and your poll results before this started. And once again, a big thank you to the panelists. This conversation was recorded as a live taping of the Global Dispatches podcast. To access that podcast and other episodes that were part of this climate security series in partnership with CGIAR, please visit globaldispatchespodcast.com. So this is part 3 of a 6-part series, and we are going to pick up again in early September for the next 3 sessions and webinars in the climate security series. So to tease that next conversation, we are going to have a video play right now. Thank you all. I hope to see you in September when we do this again, and stay safe. Thank you and goodbye.